My first paragraph would be about how Edward the Confessor dealt with the Godwin family during the early part of his reign. I would probably mention how Godwin bought Edward a warship that was twice the size of the one he bought Arthur Canute, which is trying to. It shows that Godwin really knew that he had to curry some favour with the new king, even though he'd put him on the throne, really, because without Godwin's say so, Edward could never have been king. I would have written about how Edward the Confessor dealt with it by promoting Harold Godwinson and Sweyn Godwinson to earldoms. I would have mentioned his marriage to Edith. I would have mentioned the troublesome Sweyn, who was declared nithing, which means beneath a person, an evil person, after everything that he did. I would write about how the only occasion that he stood up to Godwin came in 1047, which he only managed to do with the backing of Leofric, and he didn't send any ships to King Sweyn of Denmark. Overall, I would say at the early part of his reign, Edward was a bit overshadowed by the Godwins. Apart from that one occasion where he stood up to them, it seems like everything that Godwin wanted happened. He would have wanted his sons to be promoted to earldoms. He would have wanted Edith to be married to Godwin. To some extent, he may have wanted Sweyn Godwinson to be reinstated, although that could have been, and it's argued by some historians, that Edward did that just to upset and annoy Earl Godwin. A minor minor occurrence of defiance, perhaps. So in the early part of his reign, I would, as I said, I'd sum up and say that Edward was overshadowed by the Godwins and didn't really manage to deal with them very successfully. My second paragraph would be about the crisis of 1051-52, because that was definitely the biggest test of Edward's handling of the Godwins, an event that really did define his reign. And I would say how initially Edward dealt quite decisively with the Godwins. He managed to get his selection as Archbishop of Canterbury, going directly against the Godwins' wishes. He managed to get the rest of the country to unite behind him, certainly in the case of Leofric and Siward. He managed to get the Godwins to go into exile, and that was as thorn out of his side. The problem is, he didn't manage to follow through with the gains that he made, and he was influenced by his like for the Normans. He promoted Normans at court. This perhaps in itself seemed to have upset Siward and Leofric, who didn't really get the rewards that they might have wanted for having supported and stood behind Edward. So as a result, it meant that the Godwins were able to return, and the Earls didn't stand behind Edward when that did happen. So if I was to sum up my second paragraph on the crisis of 1051-52, I would say that Edward initially showed how far he'd come in terms of how much he was able to defy and stand up to the Godwins. When things came to a head, he showed that he had the power, but he then went and lost it and showed the frailties of his reign, how he had to bow to the whims of the Earls, and therefore ultimately the crisis of 1051-52 was a big failure and a little bit of an embarrassment for Edward, and shows that he didn't successfully deal with the Godwins with the Godwin family in that particular case. My next paragraph will be a focus on Harold Godwinson after 1052. Now, Harold Godwinson, the relationship between him and Edward is quite controversial. Some historians suggest that after the crisis, Edward had no choice but to bow to the pressures of the Godwin family. Don't forget that Earl Godwin died in 1052, not too long after the crisis ended. So some historians say that the result of the crisis was that Edward was effectively beaten, henpecked perhaps, by the Godwins and had to let them get on with it. Other historians suggest that that's not the case, and that Edward, now that Earl Godwin had gone, who he hated because of the death of Alfred, he was able to work with Harold Godwinson. I tend to be from the second court of thought. I think that Edward couldn't have been so bullied and so under the influence of the Godwins, because certainly in 1052, when this started to happen, Siward and Leofric wouldn't have stood for it. Anyway, Harold was used by Edward to put down revolts, crush revolts in Wales, and successfully managed to defeat King Gruffydd. So, dealing with the Godwin family in that sense, I would argue that Edward used Harold Godwinson and his skills really well to deal with one of his problems. One issue is that Harold Godwinson is referred to in some sources as subregulus, which really does show how much power he was willing or perhaps unable to prevent Harold Godwinson from gathering. And it seems that he used Harold Godwinson to deal with some aspects of his reign which perhaps he didn't want to, or perhaps he'd rather not deal with, leaving him to pursue with pet projects. So I would probably sum up that Edward the Confessor dealt fairly shrewdly with Harold Godwinson. I personally believe that because Earl Godwin had died, Edward was willing to work with Harold Godwinson, had a better working relationship with him, and saw the merits of using such a capable man to deal with some of the problems which he had in his reign. My last paragraph would be post 1052 again, Edward's dealings with Tostig. And one point I would make is that it was astonishing that Edward was willing to give the Godwins family such power when he promoted Tostig to Earl of Northumbria in 1055. And it turned out to be a colossal misjudgment by Edward, because Tostig was a foreigner, essentially, in the most lawless land of England, heavily influenced by years of Viking settlements. As you would know about the Danelaw, Northumbria is where the Danelaw was situated, and here Edward was putting Tostig, clearly a southerner, Wessex man, in charge. He wasn't popular. And he ruled by imposing harsh laws on the people of Northumbria, trying to get rid of this idea of the lawless country. He tended to be absent from the earldom quite a lot, and he was even accused of the assassination of Gospatrick, an earl who disagreed and seemed to be against Tostig. So he was very, very unpopular, and in this sense Edward dealt with the problem of Tostig's ambitiousness and his seeking of some power of his own. But on the other hand, it was a bit of a mistake, and by promoting Tostig to Earl of Northumbria, he caused a big problem. It wasn't very successful. To me, it shows weakness in Edward in that he gave in to the demands of those who rebelled against Tostig. Even though Tostig appeared to be a favourite of Edward and Edith's, he gave in, and that led to the exile of Tostig. It didn't really cause, the exile of Tostig didn't really cause Edward problems. In fact, it solved some problems because it meant the kingdom returned back to peace. But it did, if he went on to live a bit longer, it might have done, and it certainly caused Harold Godwinson a significant and perhaps ultimately fatal problem, because Tostig went to find Harold Hardrada and invaded England, and of course, the rest is history, as they say. My conclusion would be that Edward the Confessor didn't really deal too successfully with the Godwin family. For most of the time, he managed to keep a lid on it, and the problems didn't become too great. The only two successes he had was temporarily at the start of the crisis of 1051-52, when he managed to get his own way. And then again, I'd say that it was a success in the way that he managed to use Harold Godwinson to, say for example, successfully conquer Wales and remove the problem of King Gruffydd. But largely there are a lot of ways in which Edward the Confessor didn't deal successfully with the Godwin family. For example, insofar as initially enhancing the power of the Godwins by promoting Svein Godwinson, who, as we know, was very unsuccessful as an earl, and Harold Godwinson to earldoms, insofar as not being able to stand up to the Godwins when they returned in 1052, and certainly perhaps the biggest mistake he made was promoting Tostig to the earldom of Northumbria, and that really wasn't a success of his reign, because it was embarrassing as a climb down for him, and it led to some significant problems at the end and after Edward's reign. So overall, I would say that Edward the Confessor didn't deal as well as he could have done with the Godwin family. However, I perhaps let it be known that it was an incredibly difficult task to deal with a family that was so powerful and so power hungry.